This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 10. I Enlist the Services of a Minion. It would be interesting to know to what extent the work of authors is influenced by their private affairs. If life is flowing smoothly, are the novels they write in that period of content colored with optimism? And if things are running crosswise, do they work off the resultant gloom on their faithful public? If, for instance, Mr. W. W. Jacobs had a toothache, would he write like Hugh Walpole? If Maxim Gorky were invited to lunch by Trotsky to meet Lenin, would he sit down and dash off a trifle in the vein of Stephen Leacock? Probably the eminent have the power of detaching their writing self from their living workaday self, but for my own part, the frame of mind in which I now found myself had a disastrous effect on my novel that was to be. I had designed it as a light comedy effort. Here and there a page or two to steady the reader and show him what I could do in the way of pathos if I cared to try, but in the main a thing of sunshine and laughter. But now great slabs of gloom began to work themselves into the scheme of it. A magnificent despondency became its keynote. It would not do. I felt that I must make a resolute effort to shake off my depression. More than ever the need of conciliating the professor was borne in upon me. Day and night I spurred my brain to think of some suitable means of engineering a reconciliation. In the meantime I worked hard among the fowls, drove furiously on the links, and swam about the harbor when the affairs of the farm did not require my attention. Things were not going well on our model chicken farm. Little accidents marred the harmony of life in the fowl run. On one occasion, a hen, not Aunt Elizabeth, I am sorry to say, fell into a pot of tar and came out an unspeakable object. Eucridge put his spare pair of tennis shoes in the incubator to dry them, and permanently spoiled the future of half a dozen eggs which happened to have got there first. Chickens kept straying into the wrong coops, where they got badly pecked by the residents. Edwin slew a couple of Wyandottes, and was only saved from execution by the tears of Mrs. Eucridge. In spite of these occurrences, however, his buoyant optimism never deserted Eucridge. "After all," he said, "what's one bird more or less? Yes, I know I made a fuss when that beast of a cat lunched off those two, but that was simply the principle of the thing. I'm not going to pay large sums for chickens purely in order that a cat, which I've never liked, can lunch well. Still, we've plenty left, and the eggs are coming in better now, though we've still a deal of leeway to make up yet in that line. I got a letter from Whiteley's this morning asking when my first consignment was going to arrive. You know, these people make a mistake in hurrying a man. It annoys him. It irritates him. When we really get going, Garney, my boy, I shall drop Whiteley's. I shall cut them out of my list and send my eggs to their trade rivals. They shall have a sharp lesson. It's a little hard. Here am I, worked to death looking after things down here, and these men have the impertinence to bother me about their wretched business. Come in and have a drink, laddie, and let's talk it over." It was on the morning after this that I heard him calling me in a voice in which I detected agitation. I was strolling about the paddock, as was my habit after breakfast, thinking about Phyllis and trying to get my novel into shape. I had just framed a more than usually murky scene for use in the earlier part of the book, when Eucridge shouted to me from the fowl run. "Garney, come here. I want you to see the most astounding thing." "What's the matter?" I asked. "Blast if I know. Look at these chickens. They've been doing that for the last half-hour." I inspected the chickens. There was certainly something the matter with them. They were yawning, broadly, as if we bored them. They stood about singly and in groups, opening and shutting their beaks. It was an uncanny spectacle. "What's the matter with them?" "Can a chicken get a fit of the blues?" I asked. "Because if so, that's what they've got. I've never seen a more bored-looking lot of birds." "Oh, do look at that poor little brown one by the coop," said Mrs. Eucridge sympathetically. "I'm sure it's not well. See, it's lying down. What can be the matter with it?" "I'll tell you what we'll do," said Eucridge. "We'll ask Beale. He once lived with an aunt who kept fowls. He'll know all about it. Beale." No answer. "Beale!" A sturdy form in shirt-sleeves appeared through the bushes, carrying a boot. We seemed to have interrupted him in the act of cleaning it. "Beale, you know all about fowls. What's the matter with these chickens?" The hired retainer examined the blasé birds with a wooden expression on his face. "Well?" said Eucridge. "The old thing 'ere," said the hired retainer, "is these 'ere fowls have been and got the roup." I had never heard of the disease before, but it sounded bad. "Is that what makes them yawn like that?" said Mrs. Eucridge. "Yes, ma'am." "Poor things." "Yes, ma'am." "And have they all got it?" "Yes, ma'am." "What ought we to do?" asked Eucridge. "Well, my aunt, sir, when her fowls 'ad the roup, she gave them snuff." "Gave them snuff, she did," he repeated with relish, "every morning." "Snuff?" said Mrs. Eucridge. "Yes, ma'am. She gave 'em snuff till their eyes bubbled." Mrs. Eucridge uttered a faint squeak at this vivid piece of word-painting. "And did it cure them?" asked Eucridge. "No, sir," responded the expert soothingly. "Oh, go away, Beale, and clean your beastly boots," said Eucridge. "You're no use. Wait a minute. Who would know about this infernal roup thing? One of those farmer chaps would, I suppose. Beale, go off to the nearest farmer, and give him my compliments, and ask him what he does when his fowls get the roup." "Yes, sir." "No, I'll go, Eucridge," I said. "I want some exercise." I whistled to Bob, who was investigating a mole-heap in the paddock, and set off in the direction of the village of Up Lyme to consult Farmer Lee on the matter. He had sold us some fowls shortly after our arrival, so might be expected to feel a kindly interest in their ailing families. The path to Up Lyme lies across deep-grassed meadows. At intervals it passes over a stream by means of a footbridge. The stream curls through the meadows like a snake. And at the first of these bridges I met Phyllis. I came upon her quite suddenly. The other end of the bridge was hidden from my view. I could hear somebody coming through the grass, but not till I was on the bridge did I see who it was. We reached the bridge simultaneously. She was alone. She carried a sketching block. All nice girls sketch a little. There was room for one alone on the footbridge, and I drew back to let her pass. It being the privilege of woman to make the first sign of recognition, I said nothing. I merely lifted my hat in a non-committing fashion. "Are you going to cut me, I wonder?" I said to myself. She answered the unspoken question as I hoped it would be answered. "Mr. Garnet," she said, stopping at the end of the bridge. A pause. "I couldn't tell you so before, but I am so sorry this has happened." "Oh, thanks awfully," I said, realizing as I said it the miserable inadequacy of the English language. At a crisis, when I would have given a month's income to have said something neat, epigrammatic, suggestive, yet withal courteous and respectful, I could only find a hackneyed, unenthusiastic phrase, which I should have used in accepting an invitation from a bore to lunch with him at his club. "Of course, you understand my friends must be my father's friends." "Yes," I said so gloomily, "I suppose so." "So you must not think me rude if I—" "Cut me?" said I, with masculine coarseness. "Don't seem to see you," said she, with feminine delicacy, "when I am with my father. You will understand?" "I shall understand." "You see," she smiled, "you are under arrest, as Tom says." Tom! "I see," I said. "Good-bye. Good-bye." I watched her out of sight, and went on to interview Mr. Lee. We had a long and intensely uninteresting conversation about the maladies to which chickens are subject. He was verbose and reminiscent. He took me over his farm, pointing out as we went Dorkings with pasts, and Cochin Chinas which he had cured of diseases generally fatal, on, as far as I could gather, Christian Science principles. I'd left at last with instructions to paint the throats of the stricken birds with turpentine, a task imagination boggled at, and one which I proposed to leave exclusively to Eucridge and the hired retainer, and also a slight headache. A visit to the Cobb would, I thought, do me good. I had missed my bathe that morning, and was in need of a breath of sea air. It was high tide, and there was deep water on 3 sides of the Cobb. In a small boat in the offing, Professor Derrick appeared, fishing. I had seen him engaged in this pursuit once or twice before. His only companion was a gigantic boatman, by name Harry Hawke, possibly a descendant of the gentleman of that name who went to Widdicombe Fair with Bill Brewer and old Uncle Tom Cobley and all on a certain memorable occasion, and assisted at the fatal accident to Tom Pierce's grey mare. I sat on the seat at the end of the Cobb and watched the Professor. It was an instructive sight, an object lesson to those who hold that optimism has died out of the race. I had never seen him catch a fish. He never looked to me as if he were at all likely to catch a fish, yet he persevered. There are few things more restful than to watch someone else busy under a warm sun. As I sat there, my pipe drawing nicely as the result of certain explorations conducted that morning with a straw, my mind ranged idly over large subjects and small. I thought of love and chicken farming. I mused on the immortality of the soul and the deplorable speed at which 2 ounces of tobacco disappeared. In the end, I always returned to the Professor. Sitting, as I did, with my back to the beach, I could see nothing but his boat. It had the ocean to itself. I began to ponder over the Professor. I wondered dreamily if he were very hot. I tried to picture his boyhood. I speculated on his future and the pleasure he extracted from life. It was only when I heard him call out to Hawke to be careful, when a movement on the part of that oarsman set the boat rocking, that I began to weave romances round him in which I myself figured. But, once started, I progressed rapidly. I imagined a sudden upset. Professor struggling in water. Myself, heroically, "Courage, I'm coming!" A few rapid strokes. Saved! Sequel, a subdued Professor, dripping salt water and tears of gratitude, urging me to become his son-in-law. That sort of thing happened in fiction. It was a shame that it should not happen in real life. In my hot youth, I once had 7 stories in 7 weekly penny papers in the same month, all dealing with a situation of the kind. Only the details differed. In Not Really a Coward, Vincent Devereux had rescued the Earl's daughter from a fire, whereas in Hilda's hero it was the peppery old father whom Tom Slingsby saved, singularly enough, from drowning. In other words, I, a very mediocre scribbler, had effected 7 times in a single month what the powers of the universe could not manage once, even on the smallest scale. It was precisely 3 minutes to 12, I had just consulted my watch, that the great idea surged into my brain. At 4 minutes to 12, I had been grumbling impotently at Providence. By 2 minutes to 12, I had determined upon a manly and independent course of action. Briefly, it was this. Providence had failed to give satisfaction. I would, therefore, cease any connection with it and start a rival business on my own account. After all, if you want a thing done well, you must do it yourself. In other words, since a dramatic accident and rescue would not happen of its own accord, I would arrange one for myself. Hawke looked to me the sort of man who would do anything in a friendly way for a few shillings. I had now to fight it out with conscience. I quote the brief report, which subsequently appeared in the Recording Angel. 3-round contest, Conscience, Celestial, B.C., v. J. Garnet, unattached. Round 1. Conscience came to the scratch smiling and confident, led off lightly with a statement that it would be bad for a man of the professor's age to get wet. Garnet countered heavily, alluding to the warmth of the weather and the fact that the professor habitually enjoyed a bathe every day. Much sparring. Conscience not quite so confident, and apparently afraid to come to close quarters with this man. Time called, with little damage done. Round 2. Conscience, much freshened by the half-minute's rest, fainted with the charge of deceitfulness, and nearly got home heavily with, "What would Phyllis say if she knew?" Garnet, however, sidestepped cleverly with, "But she won't know," and followed up the advantage with a damaging, "Besides, it's all for the best." The round ended with a brisk rally on general principles, Garnet crowding in a lot of work. Conscience down twice and only saved by the call of time. Round 3 and last. Conscience came up very weak, and with Garnet as strong as ever, it was plain that the round would be a brief one. This proved to be the case. Early in the second minute, Garnet cross-countered with, "All's fair in love and war." Conscience down and out. The winner left the ring without a mark. I rose, feeling much refreshed. That afternoon I interviewed Mr. Hawke in the bar-parlour of the Net and Mackerel. "Hawke," I said to him darkly, over a mystic and conspirator-like pot of ale, "I want you, next time you take Professor Derrick out fishing—" Here I glanced round, to make sure that we were not overheard. "To upset him." His astonished face rose slowly from the pot of ale, like a full moon. "What'd I do that for?" he gasped. 5 shillings, I hope," said I, "but I am prepared to go 10. He gurgled. I encored his pot of ale. He kept gurgling. I argued with the man. I spoke splendidly. I was eloquent, but at the same time concise. My choice of words was superb. I crystallized my ideas into pithy sentences which a child could have understood. And at the end of half an hour he had grasped the salient points of the scheme. Also, he imagined that I wished the professor upset by way of a practical joke. He gave me to understand that this was the type of humour which was to be expected from a gentleman from London. I am afraid he must at one period in his career have lived at one of those watering-places at which trippers congregate. He did not seem to think highly of the Londoner. I let it rest at that. I could not give my true reason, and this served as well as any. At the last moment he recollected that he too would get wet when the accident took place, and he raised the price to a sovereign. A mercenary man. It is painful to see how rapidly the old simple spirit is dying out of our rural districts. 20 years ago, a fisherman would have been charmed to do a little job like that for a screw of tobacco. End of Chapter 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 11. The Brave Preserver. I could have wished, during the next few days, that Mr. Harry Hawks's attitude towards myself had not been so unctuously confidential and mysterious. It was unnecessary, in my opinion, for him to grin meaningly when we met in the street. His sly wink when we passed each other on the cob struck me as an indifferent taste. The thing had been definitely arranged, 10 shillings down, and 10 when it was over, and there was no need for any cloak and dark lantern effects. I objected strongly to being treated as the villain of a melodrama. I was merely an ordinary well-meaning man, forced by circumstances into doing the work of Providence. Mr. Hawks's demeanour seemed to say, "We are two reckless scoundrels, but bless you, I won't give away your guilty secret." The climax came one morning as I was going along the street towards the beach. I was passing a dark doorway, when out shimmered Mr. Hawk as if he had been a spectre instead of the most substantial man within a radius of 10 miles. "St!" he whispered. "Now look here, Hawk," I said wrathfully, for the start he had given me had made me bite my tongue. "This has got to stop. I refuse to be haunted in this way. What is it now?" "Mr. Derrick goes out this morning, sir." "Thank goodness for that," I said. "Get it over this morning, then, without fail. I couldn't stand another day of it." I went on to the cob, where I sat down. I was excited. Deeds of great import must shortly be done. I felt a little nervous. It would never do to bungle the thing. Suppose by some accident I were to drown the professor? Or suppose that, after all, he contented himself with a mere formal expression of thanks, and refused to let bygones be bygones? These things did not bear thinking of. I got up and began to pace restlessly to and fro. Presently, from the farther end of the harbour, there put off Mr. Hawks's boat, bearing its precious cargo. My mouth became dry with excitement. Very slowly Mr. Hawk pulled round the end of the cob, coming to a standstill some dozen yards from where I was performing my beat. It was evidently here that the scene of the gallant rescue had been fixed. My eyes were glued upon Mr. Hawks's broad back. Only when going in to bat at cricket have I experienced a similar feeling of suspense. The boat lay almost motionless on the water. I had never seen the sea smoother. Little ripples plashed against the side of the cob. It seemed as if this perfect calm might continue forever. Mr. Hawk made no movement. Then suddenly the whole scene changed to one of vast activity. I heard Mr. Hawk utter a hoarse cry, and saw him plunge violently in his seat. The professor turned half round, and I caught sight of his indignant face, pink with emotion. Then the scene changed again with the rapidity of a dissolving view. I saw Mr. Hawk give another plunge, and the next moment the boat was upside down in the water, and I was shooting head foremost to the bottom, oppressed with the indescribable clammy sensation which comes when one's clothes are thoroughly wet. I rose to the surface close to the upturned boat. The first sight I saw was the sputtering face of Mr. Hawk. I ignored him, and swam to where the professor's head bobbed on the waters. "Keep cool," I said. A silly remark in the circumstances. He was swimming energetically but unskilfully. He appeared to be one of those men who can look after themselves in the water only when they are in a bathing costume. In his shore clothes, it would have taken him a week to struggle to land, if he got there at all, which was unlikely. I knew all about saving people from drowning. We used to practice it with a dummy in the swimming bath at school. I attacked him from the rear, and got a good grip of him by the shoulders. I then swam on my back in the direction of land and beached him with much éclat at the feet of an admiring crowd. I had thought of putting him under once or twice, just to show him he was being rescued, but decided against such a course as needlessly realistic. As it was, I fancy he had swallowed of sea-water 2 or 3 hearty draughts. The crowd was enthusiastic. "Brave young feller," said somebody. I blushed. This was fame. "Jumped in, he did, sure enough, and saved the gentleman. Be the old soul drownded? That girt fool, Harry Hawke." I was sorry for Mr. Hawke. Popular opinion was against him. What the professor said of him, when he recovered his breath, I cannot repeat. Not because I do not remember it, but because there is a line and one must draw it. Let it be sufficient to say that on the subject of Mr. Hawke he saw eye to eye with the citizen who described him as a girt fool. I could not help thinking that my fellow conspirator did well to keep out of it all. He was now sitting in the boat, which he had restored to its normal position, bailing pensively with an old tin can. To satire from the shore he paid no attention. The professor stood up and stretched out his hand. I grasped it. "Mr. Garnet," he said, for all the world as if he had been the father of the heroine of Hilda's hero, "we parted recently in anger. Let me thank you for your gallant conduct, and hope that bygones will be bygones." I came out strong. I continued to hold his hand. The crowd raised a sympathetic cheer. I said, "Professor, the fault was mine. Show that you have forgiven me by coming up to the farm and putting on something dry." "An excellent idea, me boy. I am a little wet." "A little," I agreed. We walked briskly up the hill to the farm. Eucridge met us at the gate. He diagnosed the situation rapidly. "You're all wet," he said. I admitted it. "Professor Derrick has had an unfortunate boating accident," I explained. "And Mr. Garnet heroically dived in all his clothes, and saved me life," broke in the professor. "A hero, sir. Achoo!" "You're catching cold, old horse," said Eucridge, all friendliness and concern, his little differences with the professor having vanished like thawed snow. "This'll never do. Come upstairs and get into something of Garnet's. My own toggery wouldn't fit, what? Come along, come along. I'll get you some hot water. Mrs. Beale, Mrs. Beale, we want a large can of hot water, at once." "What?" "Yes, immediately." "What?" "Very well, then, as soon as you can. Now then, Garney, my boy, out with the duds. What do you think of this now, Professor? A sweet pretty thing in grey flannel. Here's a shirt. Get out of that wet toggery, and Mrs. Beale shall dry it. Don't attempt to tell me about it till you're changed. Socks. Socks forward. Show socks. Here you are. Coat. Try this blazer. That's right, that's right." He bustled about till the professor was clothed, then marched him downstairs and gave him a cigar. "Now, what's all this? What happened?" The professor explained. He was severe in his narration upon the unlucky Mr. Hawke. "I was fishing, Mr. Eucridge, with me back turned, when I felt the boat rock violently from one side to the other to such an extent that I nearly lost me equilibrium, and then the boat upset. The man's a fool, sir. I could not see what had happened, my back being turned, as I say." "Garnet must have seen. What happened, old horse?" "It was very sudden," I said. "It seemed to me as if the man had got an attack of cramp. That would account for it. He has the reputation of being a most sober and trustworthy fellow." "Never trust that sort of man," said Eucridge. "They are always the worst. It's plain to me that this man was beastly drunk, and upset the boat while trying to do a dance." "A great curse, drink," said the professor. "Why, yes, Mr. Eucridge, I think I will, thank you, thank you. That will be enough. Not all the soda, if you please. Ah, this tastes pleasanter than salt water, Mr. Garnet, eh? Eh? Ha ha!" He was in the best of tempers, and I worked strenuously to keep him so. My scheme had been so successful that its iniquity did not worry me. I have noticed that this is usually the case in matters of this kind. It is the bungled crime that brings remorse. "We must go round the links together one of these days, Mr. Garnet," said the Professor. "I have noticed you there on several occasions, playing a strong game. I have lately taken to using a wooden putter. It is wonderful what a difference it makes." Golf is a great bond of union. We wandered about the grounds, discussing the game, the entente cordiale growing more firmly established every moment. "We must certainly arrange a meeting," concluded the Professor. "I shall be interested to see how we stand with regard to one another. I have improved my game considerably since I have been down here, considerably." "My only feat worthy of mention since I started the game," I said, "has been to have a round with Angus McLurkin at St. Andrews." "The McLurkin?" asked the Professor, impressed. "Yes, but it was one of his very off days, I fancy. He must have had gout or something, and I have certainly never played so well since." "Still," said the Professor. "Yes, we must really arrange to meet." With Eucridge, who was in one of his less tactless moods, he became very friendly. Eucridge's ready agreement with his strictures on the erring hawk had a great deal to do with this. When a man has a grievance, he feels drawn to those who will hear him patiently and sympathize. Eucridge was all sympathy. "The man is an unprincipled scoundrel," he said, "and should be torn limb from limb. Take my advice, and don't go out with him again. Show him that you are not a man to be trifled with. The spilt child dreads the water, what? Human life isn't safe with such men as Hawk roaming about." "You are perfectly right, sir. The man can have no defence. I shall not employ him again." I felt more than a little guilty while listening to this duet on the subject of the man whom I had lured from the straight and narrow path. But the Professor would listen to no defence. My attempts at excusing him were ill received. Indeed, the Professor shewed such signs of becoming heated that I abandoned my fellow conspirator to his fate with extreme promptness. After all, an addition to the stipulated reward, one of these days, would compensate him for any loss which he might sustain from the withdrawal of the Professor's custom. Mr. Harry Hawk was in good enough case. I would see that he did not suffer. Filled with these philanthropic feelings, I turned once more to talk with the Professor of niblicks and approach shots and holes done in 3 without a brassey. We were a merry party at lunch, a lunch, fortunately, in Mrs. Beale's best vein, consisting of a roast chicken and sweets. Chicken had figured somewhat frequently of late on our daily bill of fare. We saw the Professor off the premises in his dried clothes, and I turned back to put the fowls to bed in a happier frame of mind than I had known for a long time. I whistled ragtime airs as I worked. "Rum, old buffer," said Eucridge meditatively, pouring himself out another whiskey and soda. "My goodness, I should have liked to have seen him in the water. Why do I miss these good things?" End of Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 12. Some Emotions and Yellow Lupin. The fame which came to me through that gallant rescue was a little embarrassing. I was a marked man. Did I walk through the village, heads emerged from windows, and eyes followed me out of sight. Did I sit on the beach? Groups formed behind me and watched in silent admiration. I was the man of the moment. "If we'd wanted an advertisement for the farm," said Eucridge on one of these occasions, "we couldn't have had a better one than you, Garney, my boy. You have brought us 3 distinct orders for eggs during the last week. And I'll tell you what it is. We need all the orders we can get that'll bring us in ready money. The farm is in a critical condition. The coffers are low, deuced low. I'll tell you another thing. I'm getting precious tired of living on nothing but chicken and eggs. So's Milly, though she doesn't say so." "So am I," said, "and I don't feel like imitating your wife's proud reserve. I never want to see a chicken again. As for eggs, they are far too much for us." For the last week, monotony had been the keynote of our commissariat. We had had cold chicken and eggs for breakfast, boiled chicken and eggs for lunch, and roast chicken and eggs for dinner. Meals became a nuisance, and Mrs. Beale complained bitterly that we did not give her a chance. She was a cook who would have graced an alderman's house and served up noble dinners for gourmets, and here she was in this remote corner of the world, ringing the changes on boiled chicken and roast chicken and boiled eggs and poached eggs. Mr. Whistler, set to paint signboards for public houses, might have felt the same restless discontent. As for her husband, the hired retainer, he took life as tranquilly as ever, and seemed to regard the whole thing as the most exhilarating farce he had ever been in. I think he looked on Eucridge as an amiable lunatic, and was content to rough it a little in order to enjoy the privilege of observing his movements. He made no complaints of the food. When a man has supported life for a number of years on incessant army beef, the monotony of daily chicken and eggs scarcely strikes him. "The fact is," said Eucridge, "these tradesmen round here seem to be a sordid, suspicious lot. They clamour for money." He mentioned a few examples. Vickers, the butcher, had been the first to strike, with the remark that he would like to see the colour of Mr. Eucridge's money before supplying further joints. Dawlish, the grocer, had expressed almost exactly similar sentiments 2 days later, and the ranks of these passive resistors had been receiving fresh recruits ever since. To a man, the tradesmen of Combe Regis seemed as deficient in simple faith as they were in Norman blood. "Can't you pay some of them a little on account?" I suggested. "It would set them going again." "My dear old man," said Eucridge impressively, "we need every penny of ready money we can raise for the farm. The place simply eats money. That infernal Roop let us in for I don't know what." That insidious epidemic had indeed proved costly. We had painted the throats of the chickens with the best turpentine, at least Eucridge and Beale had, but in spite of their efforts, dozens had died, and we had been obliged to sink much more money than was pleasant in restocking the run. The battle which took place on the first day after the election of the new members was a sight to remember. The results of it were still noticeable in the depressed aspect of certain of the recently enrolled. "No," said Eucridge, summing up, "these men must wait. We can't help their troubles. Why, good gracious, it isn't as if they've been waiting for the money long. We've not been down here much over a month. I never heard of such a scandalous thing. 'Pon my word, I've a good mind to go round and have a straight talk with one or two of them. I come and settle down here, and stimulate trade, and give them large orders, and they worry me with bills when they know I'm up to my eyes in work looking after the fowls. One can't attend to everything. The business is just now at its most crucial point. It would be fatal to pay any attention to anything else with things as they are. These scoundrels will get paid all in good time." It is a peculiarity of situations of this kind that the ideas of debtor and creditor as to what constitutes a good time never coincide. I am afraid that, despite the urgent need for strict attention to business, I was inclined to neglect my duties about this time. I had got into the habit of wandering off, either to the links, where I generally found the professor, sometimes Phyllis, or on long walks by myself. There was one particular walk along the cliffs, through some of the most beautiful scenery I have ever set eyes on, which more than any other suited my mood. I would work my way through the woods till I came to a small clearing on the very edge of the cliff. There I would sit and smoke by the hour. If ever I am stricken with smoker's heart, or staggers, or tobacco amblyopia, or any other of the cheery things which doctors predict for the devotee of the weed, I shall feel that I sowed the seeds of it that summer in that little clearing overlooking the sea. A man in love needs much tobacco. A man thinking out a novel needs much tobacco. I was in the grip of both maladies. Somehow I found that my ideas flowed more readily in that spot than in any other. I had not been inside the professor's grounds since the occasion when I had gone in through the boxwood hedge. But on the afternoon following my financial conversation with Eucridge, I made my way thither, after a toilet which, from its length, should have produced better results than it did. Not for 4 whole days had I caught so much as a glimpse of Phyllis. I had been to the links 3 times, and had met the professor twice, but on both occasions she had been absent. I had not the courage to ask after her. I had an absurd idea that my voice or my manner would betray me in some way. I felt that I should have put the question with such an exaggerated show of indifference that all would have been discovered. The professor was not at home, nor was Mr. Chase, nor was Miss Nora Derrick, the lady I'd met on the beach with the professor. Miss Phyllis, said the maid, was in the garden. I went into the garden. She was sitting under the cedar by the tennis lawn, reading. She looked up as I approached. I said it was a lovely afternoon, after which there was a lull in the conversation. I was filled with a horrid fear that I was boring her. I had probably arrived at the very moment when she was most interested in her book. She must, I thought, even now be regarding me as a nuisance, and was probably rehearsing bitter things to say to the maid for not having had the sense to explain that she was out. "I called in the hope of seeing Professor Derrick," I said. "You will find him on the links," she replied. It seemed to me that she spoke wistfully. "Oh, it doesn't matter," I said. "It wasn't anything important." This was true. If the professor had appeared then and there, I should have found it difficult to think of anything to say to him which would have accounted to any extent for my anxiety to see him. "How are the chickens, Mr. Garnet?" said she. The situation was saved. Conversationally, I am like a clockwork toy. I have to be set going. On the affairs of the farm I could speak fluently. I sketched for her the progress we had made since her visit. I was humorous concerning Roop, epigrammatic on the subject of hired retainer and Edwin. "Then the cat did come down from the chimney?" said Phyllis. We both laughed, and, I can answer for myself, I felt the better for it. "He came down the next day," I said, "and made an excellent lunch of one of our best fowls. He also killed another, and only just escaped death himself at the hands of Eucridge." "Mr. Eucridge doesn't like him, does he?" "If he does, he dissembles his love. Edwin is Mrs. Eucridge's pet. He is the only subject on which they disagree. Edwin is certainly in the way on a chicken farm. He has got over his fear of Bob, and is now perfectly lawless. We have to keep a steady eye on him." "And have you had any success with the incubator? I love incubators. I have always wanted to have one of my own, but we have never kept fowls." "The incubator has not done all that it should have done," I said. "Euclid looks after it, and I fancy his methods are not the right methods. I don't know if I've got the figures absolutely correct, but Euclid reasons on these lines. He says you are supposed to keep the temperature up to 105 degrees. I think he said 105. Then the eggs are supposed to hatch in a week or so. He argues that you may just as well keep the temperature at 72 and wait a fortnight for your chickens. I am certain there's a fallacy in the system somewhere, because we never seem to get as far as the chickens. But Euclid says his theory is mathematically sound, and he sticks to it." "Are you quite sure that the way you are doing it is the best way to manage a chicken farm?" "I should very much doubt it. I am a child in these matters. I had only seen a chicken in its wild state once or twice before we came down here. I had never dreamed of being an active assistant on a real farm. The whole thing began like Mr. George Ade's Fable of the Author. An author, myself, was sitting at his desk trying to turn out any old thing that could be converted into breakfast food, when a friend came in and sat down on the table, and told him to go right on and not mind him." "Did Mr. Euclid do that?" "Very nearly that. He called at my rooms one beautiful morning when I was feeling desperately tired of London and overworked and dying for a holiday, and suggested that I should come to Combe Regis with him and help him farm chickens. I have not regretted it." "It's a lovely place, isn't it?" "The loveliest I have ever seen. How charming your garden is." "Shall we go and look at it? You have not seen the whole of it." As she rose, I saw her book, which she had laid face downwards on the grass beside her. It was the same much-enduring copy of The Manoeuvres of Arthur. I was thrilled. This patient perseverance must surely mean something. She saw me looking at it. "Did you draw Pamela from anybody?" she asked suddenly. I was glad now that I had not done so. The wretched Pamela, once my pride, was for some reason unpopular with the only critic about whose opinion I cared, and had fallen accordingly from her pedestal. As we wandered down from the garden path, she gave me her opinion of the book. In the main it was appreciative. I shall always associate the scent of yellow lupin with the higher criticism. "Of course, I don't know anything about writing books," she said. "Yes," my tone implied, or I hope it did, that she was an expert on books, and that if she was not, it didn't matter. "But I don't think you do your heroines well. I have just got The Outsider." My other novel, Bastable and Kirby, 6 shillings, satirical, all about society, of which I know less than I know about chicken farming. Slated by Times and Spectator. Well received by London Mail and Winning Post. "And," continued Phyllis, "Lady Maud is exactly the same as Pamela in The Manoeuvres of Arthur. I thought you must have drawn both characters from someone you knew." "No," I said, "no, purely imaginary." "I am so glad," said Phyllis. And then neither of us seemed to have anything to say. My knees began to tremble. I realized that the moment had arrived when my fate must be put to the touch. And I feared that the moment was premature. We cannot arrange these things to suit ourselves. I know that the time was not yet ripe, but the magic scent of the yellow lupin was too much for me. "Miss Derrick," I said hoarsely. Phyllis was looking with more intentness than the attractions of the flower justified at a rose she held in her hand. The bee hummed in the lupin. "Miss Derrick," I said, and stopped again. "I say, you people," said a cheerful voice, "tea is ready. Hello, Garnet, how are you? That medal arrived yet from the Humane Society?" I spun around. Mr. Tom Chase was standing at the end of the path. The only word that could deal adequately with the situation slapped against my front teeth. I grinned a sickly grin. "Well, Tom," said Phyllis. And there was, I thought, just the faintest tinkle of annoyance in her voice. "I've been bathing," said Mr. Chase, apropos de botte. "Oh," I replied. "And I wish," I added, "that you'd drowned yourself." But I added it silently to myself. End of chapter 12.